we had already developed a full-fledged REST API server using Express and MongoDB as part of this course. In order for that server to be able to communicate meaningfully with our client, we will make a few minor adjustments to it so that it returns the right kind of data so that our client implementation can work more efficiently with the data returned from our server side. So to do that, let's work on a few adjustments to our server side in this exercise. Going to our server in the editor, before we start working on the server, I would suggest that you download all the images that I have provided as a zip file in the exercise resources called images.zip, unzip the file and then obtain all the images from there and then copy those images into the public images folder in our server. So you see that here I have copied all the images into my public images folder here already, because our server is the one that is going to serve up all these images for our client application. Next, we go to the course and adjust the whitelist here. So for our Angular client application, if we start it up with the ng-serve command, it runs at localhost :4200. So any requests coming in from our Angular application to the server will carry that as the origin there. So that is why I'm going to add that into my whitelist so that any CARS problems will be addressed automatically. So going into the cars.js file in my whitelist here, let me add in the http://localhost 4200, and this is the origin from which all my Angular client will be originating the requests that come to this server. So that way my cars would not cause problems for my Angular client. Next, we need to update a few of the routes to handle the query parameters and also a few minor other adjustments. Let me start with the promorouter.js file. So that is simple to get updated. So going to the promorouter.js file, in the promorouter file, for the get requests that we get here, instead of doing promotions find with an empty JavaScript object, here I would supply the rec.query as the parameter to the promotions find here. Same thing with the leader router also. So let me go to the leader router.js file, and in the leader router also, here where you find leaders find with the empty JavaScript object, instead replace that with the rec.query so that the query parameters will be passed in. So this is where we will pass in the featured : true as the query parameter here. Now, having adjusted these two, let's now work on the dish router. So going to dishrouter.js file, even in the dish router also, the same update here. So going to this dishes find in the get method here, change that to rec.query. So with this, my dish router update has been completed. So we have now updated the promo router, the leader router, and the dish router. Then we will move on to update the favorite router. Now, you would have implemented the favorite router as part of your fourth assignment. Now, in the favorite router, we will see that for the favorite router, I'm not showing you the remaining part because that you should have done as part of your assignment. Let me draw your attention to the get method for the favorite router route : dish ID. Now, I'm going to use this get method to just check to ensure that the specific dish with the dish ID is already a favorite for the user. So instead of simply saying get operation not supported, I am just going to leverage the presence of this get operation, and then we'll say favorites find one, and we'll say user rec.user.id, So we will find the favorites for that particular user, and then we'll say then favorites and catch error next error. And then similarly here we will add in the error here, next error here. So inside this, then when we get the favorites, then we will check if not favorites. So if there are no favorites for this user, then obviously the dish that we are checking for doesn't exist. So we'll return res status code 200 set header content type application JSON. So, and then we'll return saying exists false. So what we are specifying here is that if the get is done to this endpoint with a dish ID, this exists flag here will be set to true if this dish is part of my favorites. If this dish is not part of my favorites, I will set the exists flag to false. So here you see that since I don't have any favorites, so exists should be automatically false at this point. So we'll say exists false, and then we will return the favorites here. Well, obviously in this case the favorites would be null at this point. Otherwise, so which means that favorites is not null. So we'll say if favorites dot dishes index of. So we are going to be searching for rec params dish ID. So we're going to search this favorites dishes array to see if this dish exists in there. And if it doesn't exist, obviously this will return a negative index here. So in that case also, I will return exactly the same as here. So if it returns a negative index, then that means that even though this particular user has a set of favorites, this specific dish doesn't exist in the list of his or her favorites. So that's why I'll return exists false here. Now, otherwise, that means that the dish exists in the list of favorites. So in this case, I will return status code 200 exists is true. So that way, when the user performs a get operation on this endpoint with the /favorites/dish ID, where the dish ID is supplied as the parameter here, as the request parameter here, then we will check to see whether that dish exists in the favorites. If none of the favorites exist for this user, then we'll return an exists false. Similarly, if the favorites exist, but that particular dish doesn't exist in the favorites, then we'll return a false. Otherwise, we will return a true. So this exists flag can be used by my client to check to see if this dish is part of the list of dishes, favorite dishes for this user or not. Finally, we'll update the users.js file. Now, in the users.js file, we need to add in another router.options field here, because sometimes a post request, as you saw with the login, will send the options first to check, especially with cars, whether the post request will be allowed. So that's why we will check cars with options here, and then we'll simply return a status message of 200 in response to that. So for any endpoint under users, if we receive the options, we'll simply return a status 200 here. Now, the login function that we had implemented earlier, we had simply done passport authenticate local here, and then we checked for the remaining values here. Now, this passport authenticate local, if the user doesn't get authenticated, it simply returns an unauthorized in the reply message. Now, that may not be very meaningful for the client side to display this information. So that is why we will enhance this router post login method such that the authentication will return more meaningful information at this point. So to do that, we are not going to be doing the passport authenticate inside in here. Instead, we will take, so let me remove that from there, and then you will see how I will update the router post here. So we'll say cars with options, and then we'll include the rec, res, and next here. And inside this rec, res, and next here, passport authenticate, we'll call this with local. Now, when we call this with local, if a authentication error occurs, the passport authenticate can be made to return the error value, and also it will return the user if there is no error, and a third parameter called info, which will carry additional info that might be passed back to the user. This error will be returned when there is a genuine error that occurs in the passport authenticate. But if the user information is sent into passport authenticate, but the user doesn't exist, then that is not counted as an error. Instead, it will be counted as user doesn't exist. And that information is passed back in the info object that comes in. So the error will be returned when there is a genuine error that occurs during the authentication process, but the info will contain information if the user doesn't exist. And so the passport authenticate is passing back a message saying that the user doesn't exist, or either the username is incorrect or the password is incorrect, and so on. So that information will be passed in the info message. Now we will see how this is useful to us when we look at the client side a little bit later. So in this situation, we will handle this as follows. And not only that, when we call this passport authenticate, we also need to pass in a rec, res, next as the three parameters to it. So this is the structure when you need to call passport authenticate and expect it to pass you back information like this as a callback method here. So you also need to supply this rec, res, next right there too. Now, if this occurs, so we'll say if error. So if there is an error that occurs, we'll say return next error, and then let the error handler of our express router take care of that. Now, we'll consider other situations. If not user. So if we have reached this point, then that means that it was not an error that occurred, but instead, perhaps the user could not be found. If the user is not found, then the user here will be set to null in this case. So in that situation, if the user doesn't exist, then we need to be able to pass information back to the server side. So what we will do is we will pass in this information in this format. So I'm going to cut this out from here and then paste it in here, and then we will edit this. So if the user is null, then we will send back a status code as 401, which means unauthorized, and then we will send back information success false, and then we'll not be passing back the token, we'll pass back the status message. So here we'll say login unsuccessful, and then the third information we'll pass this info, that object that we received here, as the third part in the reply message that we send back from our server here. So the success flag will be set to false, the status will be set to login unsuccessful, and the error information that is passed in the info will be passed back. Now note that this situation will occur if either the username and the password is incorrect. And so this is not an error in the error sense, but the fact that the authenticate could not find either the user or the password of the user is incorrect. So that information will be encoded into the info that comes in, and so that I will pass back as an error to my client side. Otherwise, so the otherwise part is handled as rec.login. So if this is successful, the Passport Authenticate will add this method called rec.login to the user. So at this point, we will just simply pass in the user object that we obtained. So here, if we have reached this point, then that means that the user object is not null, and also no error occurred. So that means that the user can be logged in. And so we'll say error So we'll try to log in the user. So we'll say if error, and then we will pass back the same kind of error information that we did here. So in this case, if error, then we'll pass back a status code as 401, and we'll say success is false and status as login unsuccessful. And then the error information, we will pass this as, instead of the info, we'll pass in could not log in user. So that is the message that we'll pass back here. Okay, if the error occurs. Otherwise, we would be down below here. And so at this point, we would be able to generate the token. So if we have reached up to this point, that means that the user has successfully logged in, and so we can now generate the token. So we'll generate the token based upon the user's ID, and then we'll pass back the token back to the user. So here we will say var token, and then we can say res status code is 200, and then res JSON success true, so which means that the user successfully logged in, and so the status would be login successful. And then the third part, instead of the error, I will pass the token back to the user. So we'll say token, this token which we just obtained earlier. So that token will be passed in as the token property of the reply message. So here notice that the success is set to true, so which means that the user successfully logged in, and so the user can proceed forward at this point. And this has to be done inside the rec.login here. So at this point, we will close the rec.login. So notice that this is inside this rec.login here. So in there, we will pass these three back. So let me just indent these three lines in. And so that is how we would handle the user's login method. So again, reviewing this code one more time. So we'll do router post, but instead of doing passport authenticate right there, we will say rec res next, and then inside here we'll do a passport authenticate for the local, and this authenticate will pass back, so we can supply a callback function to that, and this callback function will return either the error, the user, or the info here. And so if it is an error, we'll just allow the express error handler to take care of that. If the user is null, then that means that the user login was unsuccessful, and the reason for that will be in the info, so that we will pass back as the info error in the reply message here. If we come up to this point, then the user is successfully verified, so then we will log in the user. So the passport authenticate will add in this method called login to the request message, so we can call the login with the user, and this, if this returns an error, then we will return the error here appropriately. If not, then we would have reached the point where the user is successfully authenticated, so we can generate the JSON Web Token here and then return the JSON Web Token to the user to confirm that the user is successfully logged in. So that is the set of steps that we're going to use here. Now, the reason why I do a more elaborate way of handling it is that I want to distinguish between the situation where a genuine error occurs during the authentication process as opposed to the situation where the user name is invalid or the password is invalid. So those two cases will be handled by this situation where the info will carry the information back to us. So that's not a error per se, but that's a situation where the user is not a valid user or the user's password is not valid. So that's how we will handle the user's login process. In addition, I will add in one more method here called check JWT token. It is quite possible that while the client has logged in and obtained the JSON Web Token, sometime later the JSON Web Token may expire. And so if the user tries to access from the client side with an expired token to the server, then the server will not be able to authenticate the user. So at periodic intervals, we may wish to cross-check to make sure that the JSON Web Token is still valid. So that is the reason why I am including this another endpoint called check JWT token. So if you do a get to the check JWT token by including the token into the authorization header, then this call will return a true or a false to indicate to you whether the JSON Web Token is still valid or not. If it is not valid, then the client side can initiate another login for the user to obtain a new JSON Web Token if required. So to do this, we'll say cars with options and rec res here as expected, and in here we will say passport authenticate JWT and session false. and this would return error user info. So recall how we used the passport authenticate earlier. So we called the JWT with session false here. So earlier here we said passport authenticate local. So this is for the local authentication. So this is for the JSON Web Token authentication. So when we call that, then since that is going to verify the JSON Web Token, so we'll say if error return next error, and then let the Express error handler take care of that situation. And then we'll say if not user, if the user doesn't exist, then similarly else. So which means that if the user object was found from the JSON Web Token and then loaded onto the rec.user, then that means that the user is a valid user and so can be allowed to proceed forward. Otherwise, we're going to say that the user doesn't exist, so we need to infer that the JSON Web Token has expired. So at this point, we'll send a res with the status code of 401, so unauthorized, set header, content type, application JSON, and then we'll return res.json. We'll say status JWT invalid, and then we'll return a flag called success false, and then we'll return the info that we obtain if the user is not authenticated as the error at this point. Otherwise, that means that we reach this point, then the user is a valid user. So in this case, let me just copy that code here. We'll be sending a status code of 200, and then the res.json will send JWT valid, and success will be true. And the third part, we will send the user's information. So that way, when this endpoint is called with the get method, then this will verify whether the token is valid or not. If the token is valid, then you will receive this reply, and from the success flag in the reply, you can check to see whether the JSON Web Token is valid or not. And this is useful on the client side. Now this passport here, passport authenticate here, will have to be supplied with rec and res as the two parameters here. So that's how we call the passport authenticate. So notice that whenever you call passport authenticate and expect this callback function in here, you need to append this point rec.res to the passport authenticate at the back here. So with this, we have updated everything on the server side. So let's save all the changes on the server side. So now our server is all ready to handle the incoming requests from our Angular client. With this, we complete this exercise. In this exercise, we have now prepared our Express server to handle incoming requests from our Angular client. In the next exercise, we're going to look at the Angular client in more detail to understand how it is communicating with this Express server. This is a good time for you to do a Git commit with the message integrating client and server.